great way to actively be church is to study theology. The people is what theology is ultimately about. I think to study theology is one of the most meaningful things you can do. You start to realize that union with God is a present day, not just a possibility, but a reality. Hi everyone, Angela here. I'm a creative and theologian, and it's the 19th Sunday in Ordinary Time. So we are still in chapter 12 of Luke. We're continuing on from last week, really. So Christ starts off by saying, there's no need to be afraid, little flock, because it pleases your Father to give you the kingdom. And then he goes into his parables, as Jesus tends to do. And he's saying things like, sell your possessions and give alms and get yourselves purses that don't wear out, because your treasure, you ought to work on your treasure that's in heaven, a treasure that a moth can't get to and eat it out, or a thief can't reach it. Because where your treasure is, there is where your heart is. And he goes on, continuing on in the parable mode, saying things like, make sure you're ready, make sure your lamp lit and that you're dressed for action. You had to be like a servant who waiting for their master to come back from the wedding feast. Because once your master reach back, you have to be ready to open that door. And once you do, trust and believe that master going to sit you down at the table and serve you. But then at one point, Peter speaks up and he's like, but Christ, who this for? This for us. This for everybody who wait for. And then Jesus kind of like, I think he answers the question, but he also kind of doesn't answer directly at the same time. And you say, well, what kind of steward then? What kind of servant is the one that the master will put in charge? Who wise enough, who faithful enough to the master to do what he asks? Who knows what he wants and does it, as opposed to knowing what he wants but not doing it, instead of taking advantage of the situation for their own self, for their own self-aggrandizement. I think that's how you say that word. Don't matter. But yeah, he's saying they could be eating and drinking and getting drunk, and if you're only studying yourself and you're complacent, then you ain't going to even realize when the master reach back. So he says that, that servant who knows what the master wants, but he doesn't do it, he will have a lot more severe consequences to deal with than a servant who mightn't have been so aware of what the master wanted. So, of course, if you're not aware, he wouldn't do it either, right? Excuse me. And then Christ ends us off with the Uncle Ben from Spider-Man, where he says, a person who has a great deal given to them, a great deal will expect of them. And then if a person has a great deal given to them on trust, or another word that we might say now, given to them on credit, then even more will be expected of that person. Now, this gospel is a long one, and I do think my reflection is also going to come out to be a long one too. And I will also say that it might sound like one big ad, but I promise you that is not an ad. It's just that I'll mention some organizations and people that it will make it sound like it's advertising. And I suppose really I am trying to achieve publicity in this. But I guess what I'll say is I don't get paid for this then. I ain't getting paid to do this. But anyways, as usual, whenever this happens, I will encourage you to go over to US Catholic Magazine's website or their YouTube channel, because I would have did a reflection for them for this same weekend's readings, the 19th Sunday in Ordinary Time. And I will say I'm happy with how it came out. And I just hope that the content in that, whether you read or you watch or you listen, I hope that whatever is in there, God is able to reach you through those words. That the Holy Spirit takes those words, and by the time it reaches to your eyes or to your ears, they are transformed into what you might need in that particular point in time, and that it is enough. Now, to get into this reading here, this Luke 12:32 to 48, I will adapt the words of a Drake song, where I think this reading sounds like what studying theology feels like. And I'll explain why, of course, but from the outset, before I get into the details of that, I will say that if you are located in Trinidad and Tobago, one of the best places that you can study theology is at the Regional Seminary of St. John Vianney and the Uganda Martyrs, known affectionately as SJVUM. Although I think I saw something recently about we are now called the Theological Institute or something. I mean, I don't know when we underwent a rebrand, but at the same time, that's not necessarily my place to know. I suppose it is supposed to appeal to lay people more. And it seems like a good idea on paper. I mean, who's to say, right? We'll see how it plays out. But regardless, whatever it's called, it is one of the places where I teach. And I can say that it is a welcoming environment to anyone who comes up. And I say come up because we are located on Mount St. Benedict, and that's in Tunapuna. But the thing is, the seminary is not just for boys who are interested in priesthood. And it's also not just for religious either. The thing is, it's for lay people, not just men, and it's for non-Catholics as well as for Catholics alike. I think what makes SJVUM especially attractive is that it is a free-thinking space. Or at least for my part, I could say that I do try to encourage my students to push the boundaries of their thoughts and to explore whatever they might be feeling. As I'm sure you know, the classic definition of theology is faith-seeking understanding. And I could only hope that my students leave their courses with that same curiosity and confidence to continue seeking to understand their faith. But anyway, let me get into the reading itself now. So in general, from what it seems like, at least based on when I was preparing for this reflection, scholars tend to agree that this story is a part of Luke that is meant to warn against greed or avarice, especially given the affluence of some in the Lucan community. Because as I'm sure you already know, Luke was writing to a predominantly Gentile or Hellenistic audience. It seems like he wanted to instill Christian values of selflessness, or you might know the Greek word as kenosis, that's self-emptying, humility, and, of course, a care and concern for the poor. But when I think of wealth, like what Christ is talking about here, I can't help but think of theology. And I know that sounds weird to say, especially because as far as I can see, there isn't a lot of money to be made in this field, especially not for lay people, or at least not in any honest or genuine way. But speaking for myself here, studying theology really does feel like you found the treasure that Christ talked about, I think it's Matthew 13, where he talks about you find the treasure in a piece of land, so then you go and sell everything you have to go and buy the land to then own that treasure. I think that's what studying theology is like. I think that treasure is what can fill our hearts with gladness. Because to study theology comes like having treasure in heaven. And I don't mean that in some kind of meritorious kind of way, but more so that studying theology helps you to uncover heaven inside of you. And that is where the richness of life begins. Because you start to explore your relationship with God in a deeper and a more meaningful way. You start to realize that union with God is a present day, not just a possibility, but a reality. You start to realize that union with God isn't just some eschatological occurrence. But this richness of life, this isn't just for clergy and religious alone. Because it's like Peter asked, who the parable for? It's for all of us. This richness of life is available to all of us, especially since the majority of our church is largely made up of lay people, which makes this need even more urgent for lay theologians. Because at the end of the day, it's not the priest's church, it's not the bishop's church, it's not the Pope church, this is our church. How are we supposed to be church if we are not actively being church? And a great way to actively be church is to study theology. Not the only way, obviously, but it's a great way. Obviously, I'm biased in saying that though. But I say that because the reign of God that Christ is talking about here, this kingdom of God, It belongs to those curious enough to enter into it. And to study theology is to engage that curiosity. Plus, it not only gives you a sense of ownership for God's promise for humanity, it gives you a sense of belonging as well. In a paradoxical way, though. Because to belong to yourself in God, your true self, as Richard Rohr would describe it, is to inevitably be alienated from all you would have known and accepted growing up. Studying theology challenges a lot of those childhood beliefs and constructs and understandings that you would have inherited back then. So you experience a simultaneous exclusion as well as belonging. And really, I think the grief is worse than the exclusion itself. Because we feel alienated from our younger foundations. What at that point in time in our lives is all we would have known. And of course, we have major emotional attachment to those. And to be honest, something would be wrong if we didn't. And while I personally haven't figured this out yet, I think the accepting of the alienation and the letting go of it helps make the alienation more bearable. I don't know if it ever goes away, but I could at least reasonably believe that it gets more bearable. Because in a way too, it does feel like you're alienated from your communities. The communities you would have known then, at least in my experience. Now, I have also lived in 2 different countries, meaning in Trinidad and Tobago as well as in the US when I was studying. So I don't doubt that that experience, of course, has a major influence on this aspect of this reflection as well. But sometimes it feels like to study theology is to disagree with the crowd. Or maybe to have moved on is a better description. It ends up feeling like your community before the journey where you would have belonged is no longer a place where you can say you feel at home. I guess it's similar to Jesus in Luke 4, right? And I know people studying theology who would feel this deeply, this sense of alienation and belonging. The other side of that, though, is just like the hope that we have in this story here. Meaning that the awake servants are served by the master. And studying theology really does feel like you get to sit at table and dialogue with the master. And his work, yes, and his dog work sometimes, to be honest. But those moments with the master when the master feels near is definitely worth it. Or to echo the words of a dear friend of mine, this is Scott De Silva, when he's talking about fatherhood. He says the 90% of the horrors is worth the 10% of the joy, because really and truly is all joy, is 100% joy. And I think studying theology feels like that. I mean, I don't know what it means to be a father just yet, if at all, but I would like to believe that that's what studying theology feels like too. I think studying theology opens you up to friendship as well. Like, I think of the way the Conference on Theology in the Caribbean today, I think of the way the CTCT operates. It's not just a collective of peers and acquaintances. People do share genuine bonds, lifelong bonds through the studying theology together. It's like going back to last week, right, where the rich man in the parable, he had this idea that his riches were his possessions, but he never got to enjoy that, right? Versus we come to know that the riches in life isn't material things, it's not the possessions, but rather is the quality of the relationships that you share while you're here. Studying theology offers you solid, proper friendships, relationships. Now, to remember the words of one of my dear friends, and fun fact, the first named professor of theology at the University of the West Indies, and this is at Mona, this is Jamaican theologian Anna Kasafi Perkins, where when we were in Barbados and Anna was delivering her lecture, she said something that she often says, where she said, we stand on the shoulders of giants. And theology helps you to stand on those shoulders. Theology gives you a leg up, I guess you could say. Now, not everybody is called to be a professional theologian, and not everyone is able to do classes in theology. At the end of the day, it does run heavy on the academics too, and in most of the courses. And heavy academics is not for everybody. It's probably not for most people, honestly. I get that. And academics might be a supposed objective standard of intelligence. At least that's what the global north says. But I think we're starting to see the flaws in that logic and start to realize how microscopic and blindsided logic like that is. And this might be presumptuous of me, but at least from what I observe, from what I gather, I don't even think most future priests are called to be professional theologians, which is fine. I don't doubt their vocations to pastor and to shepherd. I think that much is visible on so many of them. But when it comes to the actual study of theology, I feel like they could be eased up a bit. I mean, yes, I think some foundational courses should be done for sure, but I don't know about a whole degree. At the same time, though, that's definitely not my place to judge. It's not my decision to make. And who's to say what God does with them through those courses? We might necessarily see any major benefit now, but years down the line, who's to say what happens? It's like seeds planting. I think studying theology is kind of like planting seeds in a way too. Of course, not everybody could afford to study theology at an official institution, which is one of the major reasons why I try to be so faithful to this reflection thing week after week. Because I was freely given an opportunity to study, thanks to people at the Barry University Theology and Philosophy Department, especially my dear friend and mentor, Father Mark Wiedig, who since 2019 has been the president of the Aquinas Institute of Theology in Missouri. But because of that, I try to give freely through this channel. But if you are considering studying theology, at least in Trinidad and Tobago, don't let cost be an issue. Reach out to me and we will find a way to make it work. It mightn't be the best business model, but the church has more than enough money to be able to sustain theology students if it so chooses. And again, it's not just for seminarians, lay people too. People from all walks of life, Catholic, non-Catholic, men, women, rich, poor. It's for everybody. The call is for everybody. The thing is, as a church, we often put profits over people. But as theologians, we have to be the balancing force against the bureaucracy and the over-capitalistic mentality that our church, unfortunately, sometimes promotes. So if you do feel called to study theology, please don't let cost be an issue. I think one of the roles of theology now is to at least be accessible enough that it is a symbol of an open arm God. Similar to this image of Christ in the SJVUM chapel. As a side note, in the image you should see another dear friend of mine. This is Adana James, the Dean of Studies at SJVUM. I believe she's also the first lay woman to be the dean too. And to remember Anna's words, Adana is another giant of ours in the Caribbean theology space. And I mean, I personally owe my being at the seminary to her because it was like, if I remember correctly, a good 2 to 3 years that she was making room for me to come in. Now, I don't think he's in the photo because I'll have to see the picture. I just remember it briefly, vaguely, sorry. So I can't remember for sure, but I also think of the principal, Father Jason Boswin. And I mean, I don't know Jason like super, super well, but I have yet to meet anybody who has anything but the highest of praises to sing about this man. And even from my interactions with him, he struck me as a real humble person. Like, he's brilliant and he's confident and he's not pushy. You know what I mean? He doesn't use his masculinity to push up and try to bravado the scene and overpower nobody. He listens deeply and he brings good, pure energy, I think, to any room he walks into. I think the seminary is super lucky to have him. And as long as the local seminary is being led by people like Adana and Jason Boswell, then I think the future of Catholic academic theology is in really good hands. And then continuing further, if people like Adana and like Anna, and I'm about to name a whole set of people here, but I ain't leaving out anybody intentionally, but people like Father Stephen Alexander and Pastor Ingrid Ryan Rubin, Alison McCletchie, June Johnson, Everett Johnson, Paba, Monsignor Patrick Anthony, Bernadette Gopal Ram Kalawan, Gloria Bertrand, Martin Sergiu, Stephanie Baldeo Singh, Michael Woodruff, Don Chambers, Nicole Poyer, Rhonda Earl, Peter Jordan, Ramon Luceraga, Sonia Hines, and so many others. If they aren't the face of theology in the Caribbean and the giants for the up and coming generations of theologians for their shoulders to stand on, then I just don't know who is. And then I also don't know what the state of Caribbean theology is, if that's the case. But back to this idea of theology being a symbol of God's open arms. Like, we spend so much time reading and writing, and for sure we should be paid fairly for our work and not just have to fight up to try to secure teaching jobs, because theology is more than just being able to teach. It's a whole lot more than that. At the same time, at least for me, it feels like 90% of what I read is the food that the master brings back from the wedding banquet. He brings that back to serve to the servants. But that food has to be served right away. We might as well share it with the people who will never delve into a papal encyclical or into a book by Karl Rahner. Which, if you do delve into Rahner, please proceed with caution. And don't get me wrong, I have the most respect for Rahner. I just also have PTSD from studying his work. We do have to share what we read and what we study in a digestible way, though. Because the last thing that we should be doing is gatekeeping the fruits of what we do. Again, institutions should pay fairly, but the people is what theology is ultimately about. The poor is what theology is ultimately about, not the academics and the lecture halls. Because the people are God's people. The church refers to itself as the people of God for a reason. On a personal note, I read something surprising this week from the first CTCT published book from over 30 years ago, and I believe Pablo was the editor, if I remember correctly. So Robert Schreiter, who was there apparently, told the audience that Caribbean theology ought to be practical theology. Like, this is his sense then. And he described practical theology as occupying the space between strict academics and simply applied theology. And I think that was a good description. I think if I had to describe it, even though this is not the fullest description of it, but I think is at least a starting point, practical theology is a very liberal arts type of theology. I think it gives you a lot of room to be able to explore a lot of different things. I think practical theology is an area where you get to exercise searching for wisdom, seeking wisdom. Like, it helps you to integrate a lot of who you are and your life experiences into being able to then channel the same message that Christ has given us here today. And I mention that because there is no surprise in it. Strange enough, my degree, well, my master's, is in practical theology and ministry. And again, that's because of people like Father Mark and Sister Gloria Schaub and Father Jorge Presmanes, Father Jose David Padilla. I mean, the whole set of them, right? Every teacher I've ever had. And of course, the master scholar, who, I guess in a way, I kind of like his namesake, unintentionally though, but this is Father Jerry Austin. Even though I never sat in one of his academic classes, because the amount of time Father Jerry and I would have spent conversing and reasoning, the amount of homilies I would have taken from him, and the amount of time we just spent together, like I could really say that he is a major formator of mine. Absolutely brilliant man. So to read Schreiter's address was very affirming. And it felt prophetic in a way too. That, well, I was probably like 1, maybe 2 years old when that conference would have taken place. But to see this foreign theologian having this sense, and then other foreign theologians, not directly related, to then come and facilitate his ideas, to all feed back into the Caribbean ultimately, for us to continue our own seeking. However it might look in 2025, I mean, I think that's prophetic. Was the phrase, I don't know who this is credited to, I didn't check before I started to record, but the phrase that once you have your education, nobody could take it away from you. Like before I would have went to university, I would have completely disregarded this idea. And to be honest, the way the secondary school system is currently made up, I still kind of feel that way. But I used to wonder, what's the point of education? But I've come to know now what a gift free thought is. And theology offers a space for free thought. Theology offers a space for freedom of thought. Now, I know that I don't have high numbers and viewership when it comes to this YouTube channel, right? So if anyone makes it even this far in the video, I'm not sure if you've already taken theology courses or not. I mean, you probably have. But if you haven't, I would really ask you to consider studying theology when you're praying for God's guidance in your life. Maybe not as your only field of study, but definitely I think if you have the capacity to bring it in to your life, even if it's a very, what some people might describe as slow pace, I really hope you do. Because it might lead you to taking a class, and it might lead you otherwise. Either which way is fine. There's no right and wrong road, right? There's a right road and a left road, but no right and wrong road. But again, as long as theology can be a symbol of God's open arms for all of creation, then I know I can speak for many theologians when I say that we are happy to have a conversation with you. And with anybody, really. Like, we don't have to agree, we don't have to believe the same things. But we don't have a conversation. And if you have questions, then we are down to accompany you in those questions too. Some theologians might propose to say that we might have an answer for you. And we might be very well intentioned with that. I mean, we might have an answer from the catechism, we might have an answer from some great scholar, we might have an answer through a story of ours. And those things obviously count for something meaningful, right? And they help to move your process along. But if it's one thing studying theology has shown me, my perspective of truth and my answer probably isn't your perspective of truth and your answer. And that's not to sound relativist, because it's the same truth that we all looking into. We all seeking to understand our faith. But it's more to say that we all revolve around the same God. When we are side by side as a church, so it comes like if this is God here in the middle, and we all revolving around God, and we all moving around the same God, but we all have different angles, different perspectives, as we're supposed to be as church, side by side, not one in front of the other and pushing each other and blocking each other like a bad carnival fete. And because we all revolve around the same truth, that truth could look different to different eyes. And then worse yet, when we had to communicate what is inside of us with our words, now that same truth is going to come out sounding very different. But in essence, our hearts ought to display our oneness. I think my dream overall for those of us studying theology is to see a revolution of the heart take place, or a conversion, or metania, metanoia, however you pronounce it. That Greek word that we often translate as conversion, right? Or as I would say, a revolution of the heart. Because ultimately that's what all the baptized are called to, right? To that conversion. And that's what will be a major source of social justice in our world. That is what will help on earth to be as it is in heaven. And again, studying theology should ultimately be for the people. I mean, we get the benefit, yes, it's enjoyable, but it doesn't end here. It reaches out, or it ought to reach out to the wider community, especially those who need it most, first and foremost. So yeah, to end this video, I will once again big up SJVUM, and I'll really encourage you, if you can, to enroll in one of our courses, mine especially, but of course I'm biased. As of right now, I do 2 courses. One is the blank there for a second. We're about to do a systematics course starting in September. This is the intro to systematics. And I also do Christian preaching and electronic media. But again, of course I'm biased, right? But sign up for any one of the courses, really. Anything you see interest in, sign up. And for real, once you can, please consider it. Because we need all the help that we could get. As theologians, we need all the help that we could get. And I think to study theology is one of the most meaningful things you can do. But again, I am biased, right? Anyways, that's it from me this week. And as always, I appreciate you so much for watching. Thank you.